Over the last 6 or 7 years, something remarkable has happened. Age has become the most reliable predictor of somebody's political opinions and voting intentions. A political generation gap has opened up on a simply massive scale. The general picture is this: young people are more likely to vote left and hold left-wing views, while older generations are tending to vote right and hold conservative social and political views. The most obvious illustrations of this can be found in the 2017 and 2019 UK general elections. If we ask what was common to both those elections, but which doesn't really predate them, we'd have to point to this huge divergence in the way the young and old are voting. Let's lay out the dimensions of the phenomenon. In 2010, Labour had just a 1% lead over the Conservatives among 18 to 24-year-olds. By 2017, that had exploded to 45%. In a famous poll from 2017, for every 10 years older somebody was, there were 9% more likely to vote Conservative, until amongst the over 65, the Conservatives were 36% more popular than Labour. Let's think about the scale of that change. In the 2010 general election, the difference between the voting patterns of the youngest and oldest cohorts was just 15 points. At the 2017 election, that generation gap had leapt to an astonishing 97 points. And a very similar pattern held in the 2019 election, with Labour leading by 43% amongst the youngest cohort and the Tories leading by 47% amongst the oldest. Perhaps you just think this is natural, that young people are always left-wing. Well, there has been a general post-war trend of people becoming more conservative as they age, but this trend is neither natural nor universal. In the 1979 and 1983 elections, for instance, more 18 to 24-year-olds voted Conservative than Labour. In fact, in the 1983 elections, more 25 to 35-year-olds did as well. So that suggests there must be something specific about our historical moment that's caused the political age divide to suddenly grow to such a huge and unprecedented scale. There's one more thing we need to take into account when discussing the current political generation gap. It's not limited to the UK. A very similar pattern has emerged in many different countries at roughly the same time. The most obvious example is in the US, where the two Bernie Sanders campaigns for the Democratic Party presidential nomination played a similar role there to the one played by Jeremy Corbyn's leadership of the Labour Party here. Both rallied the young to the left in their respective countries. As a result, the political generation gap was seen most clearly in the US, where Bernie took on first Hillary Clinton in 2016 and then Joe Biden in 2020. The age divide in polling looked quite similar there to the two recent UK general elections. So we have this phenomenon that appears suddenly on an international, although not globally uniform scale. This means we must look for a cause, or at least a trigger for the phenomenon that is also international and punctual. We're looking for a sudden event or a moment of change which had international effects. I think the 2008 financial crisis fits the bill. The way that crisis played out across the 2010s crystallized and accelerated a longer-term reshaping and divergence of material interest between the generations. Those over 55, but especially over 65, who own their own homes and have financialized pensions, they found their interests increasingly aligned with the performance of the linked finance and real estate sectors. If property prices are high, for instance, they will feel wealthier. They can withdraw equity, borrow at lower rates of interest. Well, this is not true for the young, who are largely cut off from home ownership and dependent on wages. And wages have been stagnating for decades. The government response to 2008 has massively favoured older asset holders at the expense of the young. The huge government support for the financial sector, the bailouts, quantitative easing, these have all in effect given an ocean of free money to the financial sector. Very little of this has gone into business investment, which might have raised wages. Instead, the vast majority of it has just gone into inflating asset prices. Stock markets, house prices are at record highs. In the meantime, the 2010s were the worst decade for wage growth in the UK since the Napoleonic Wars. As a consequence, millennials are forecast to be the first generation in modern times to have lower lifetime earnings than the generation that came before. It's easy to see that the current political generation gap is epochal in character, and it isn't going away because it emerges from the structural crises of our time. Just think about climate change and the generational injustices that involves. Over the last 30 years, we've emitted more than half of all the carbon that's ever been emitted into the atmosphere from burning fossil fuels. The first international agreements to fight climate change were signed around 30 years ago. So all that carbon has been emitted while we've been fully aware of its consequences. It's the young and the generations to come who will have to deal with those consequences. Look, I'm not arguing in favour of generational conflict. The old are not the enemy. But it's time we recognise that the material interests of older generations might be leading them to look away from the pressing crises of the present. This isn't true of the young. Their interests are leading them to demand action and solutions which are more egalitarian in nature. Young people are leading protests and social justice movements around the world. Perhaps the rest of us should stop dismissing them as snowflakes and start following their lead.